let's do a little, go back and do a little GDP here. That last video I did was a little bit hard to see. Let's see if we can make this any better. Um, all right. So you should have some kind of cheat sheet for GDP. Make sure you understand circular flow. The College Board loves to test circular flow, but the questions are only on the simple circular flow. Households own all land, labor, and capital. They sell it into the resource or what we could call a factor market, right? And then they're going to sell it to firms. Firms buy or demand all those factors of production and sell goods and services in the what they also call output. We could have called goods and services. Just like we could call land, labor, and capital inputs. I don't really like this. I kind of do it slightly different, even though it's on my cheat sheet. The same thing works. Firms are going to sell goods and services or output into the product market where households are going to buy or demand goods and services out of the product market. There's a cheat sheet on my website. You should be able to find that. If you don't, just send me a quick email and I'll send it to you. Not too many questions on leakages and injections, but we should know them. Leakages are anything that reduces your circular flow. So if taxes increase, you can't be buying goods and services because your money's going toward the government. That would be a leakage. Savings, if you're putting money in the bank, you're not buying stuff, so you're reducing the circular flow. Or if you're buying foreign goods, you're not spending your money on our country's stuff. That's all a leakage. And obviously the opposite is true. Any government spending drops money into the economy. We consider that an injection. If you're investing, you're putting money in and buying goods and services, that is definitely a injection. And then exports. If people or foreigners are buying our stuff, they're making our circular flow larger. So you should just know all of those. I've never seen them on a released exam, but I've definitely seen these leakages and injections on unreleased exams. So spend some time. Obviously, for GDP, we need to have a good definition in our head of what GDP is. It is the value of all final goods and services produced, obviously produced in the United States or whatever country you're talking about in a year. Not consumed, not exchanged, produced. Have to be produced, right? Even if things are consumed, if they had said the value of all final goods and services consumed in the United States, well, that includes used goods. So that would not be a right definition. It has to be what's produced in that year, all final goods and services. A big part of what GDP tests for are these things that are included and excluded. Obviously, goods and services. Know how those factors of production are paid for. This is more of the income side of the equation, which we don't tend to use too much. But profit is for entrepreneurship. That's payment for entrepreneur. Interest would be payment for capital. Wages are obviously payment for labor. Rent is obviously payment for land. Does the College Board test this very heavily? I've never seen it tested heavily. I mean, they could test it, but I've never seen it. But you should just have that in your brain. Know those factors of production, land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Know how they're paid, rent, wages, interest, and profit. Easy enough. Let's jump on the excluded side because I think that's what's really important here. There's not too, I think we've done away with GNP. We don't tend to see that anymore on any of our tests. A long time ago, they've gotten rid of that. So this probably isn't necessary, but it does make for a nice, some teachers do teach GNP. If you need it, excellent. What's excluded from GDP is intermediate goods. Remember, it's all final goods and services produced in the country. So that, think about that for a second. If I buy a car and it's $50,000, trust me, I'm not buying a car for $50,000 bucks. But if I did, that would be counted toward GDP. But we would not count all the steel, the rubber, the tires, the electronics. We would not count them and the price of the car because that would be double counting. We assume that all those intermediate goods that go into making up that car, those are counted in the $50,000 final price. That's why we only count the final goods and services where they actually get sold to customers. Transfer payments, Social Security, unemployment, alimony, gifts, welfare benefits. Um, all of these things are just money that people get. Social Security because you're retired or a certain age or you're disabled. Unemployment because you don't have a job. Alimony because you become divorced, I guess. Gifts, your parents give you gifts, that doesn't count toward GDP. And welfare, people who get money because they don't make enough. These are just transfer payments. Nobody's doing anything to get these things. Don't talk to me about Social Security. I understand that people worked hard and long to achieve Social Security. But you're not producing anything while you're getting Social Security. I think that's what we're talking about here. There's nothing being produced. You're just unemployed or you're just not making enough income. Therefore, you get welfare benefits. Transfer payments not included. Just know it. Stocks and bonds. So if I buy $1 million share of stock, that is not included in GDP because the only thing that I stock is just a piece of paper saying that I own a part of a company, right? I give them $1,000 or whatever. I own a share of a company. It's just a piece of paper. I give them the money. They give me the piece of paper saying I own that stock. Or if I buy a bond, same thing. It's just paper changing hands and money going one way and paper coming back. There's nothing actually produced. Stocks and bonds are purely financial transactions. Nothing's produced, no tangible goods. But what is included is the guy who actually sells those stocks and bonds for you. So if he makes 1% of my $1,000,000, that would go toward GDP because he is providing a service in the year. He's producing something. He's actually selling those stocks and bonds. The price of the value of the stocks and bonds is not counted, but the service that the commission or the broker would make on the sale is counted. I hope that makes sense. Obviously, final goods and services are included. Used goods, secondhand sales, used goods never counted, right? They were counted in the year they were actually produced. Non-market transactions, drugs, prostitution, housework, babysitting, lots of these are under the table. If you're not paying taxes on it, you're not recording it, the government doesn't know about it, therefore it cannot be part of GDP. The housework we could probably take care of. This is one, and we'll talk about this later. This is one of the things that GDP gets criticized for. If I paint my house, it's not counted to GDP. But if I pay you to paint my house, well, that would be counted to GDP. So obviously, if you claimed it as that was your business, right, or you claimed it as income, it would be counted to GDP. So lots of people, I stay home with my kids. Some people want that to be counted toward GDP because obviously something's produced, right? I'm taking care of kids. Again, one of the things that's criticized about GDP, but we're not going to worry about that just yet. All right. Big thing to know here is expenditure. The expenditure approach to measuring GDP is where most of our energy is going to go because this is what's tested most. C plus I plus G plus XN. The C stands for consumption. The I stands for investment. The G stands for government spending. Anything the government spends money on gets counted toward GDP. And net exports, which is exports minus imports. Now you have to know it's exports minus imports, right? Remember, exports are in addition to GDP. Imports would be a subtraction from GDP. The other thing to make sure you recognize is investment. How do we define it? It is capital goods. I think of it as tools, equipments, factories, machinery. It is also new houses. Those are considered investments. And where the College Board gets really tricky is these additions to inventories. We could say there's increases, additions, or changes in inventories. All are added to GDP. And you're going to say, Charles, I don't know what you mean by that. And I agree. Why would we? But let's talk about it for just a second. If in 2006, you and I produce shoes, and then those shoes sit in our inventory and they're not sold until 2007, my question to you be, what year do they get counted in GDP? 2006 when they're produced, or 2007 when they're sold? And obviously, you would say, Charles, quit being stupid. They're going to be counted in GDP when they're produced. But my question to you would then, what category do they go into? Right? And We recognize that they're not exported or imported. They're not government spending, and nobody's buying them until 2007, so they can't go into consumption. So they have to flow into investment, right? That's what we mean by increases, additions, or changes in inventory are added to GDP. These things, even though they're not sold, they flow into investment, and therefore they're counted in investment as GDP. I hope that makes sense. That always tends to cause a lot of confusion there. All right, we covered it. There is the income approach. Again, not tested very heavily. There is a value-added approach. I've only seen this as an example on one FRQ, but you didn't have to even talk about the value. It was just a choice you could have made. Most teachers tend to skip the value-added. We do have to know some nominal and GDP stuff. We'll talk about those in a bit. We should have a good BOA. We'll talk about some of this during we'll talk about CPI in the next video. CPI is very important. It kind of follows under the GDP side of things. So anyway, let's go on and just jump into some of the problems. I hope we can see that okay. Last video I made, one guy wrote and said, I can't see anything. I understand. Technology doesn't always work with me the way I think it should. Anyway, let's look at GDP. It's the sum of all exchanges of goods and services during a period. I'm going to let you read these, and then we're going to talk about them. All right. So, lots of people look at A and they think it's all goods and services. This is all goods and services, but exchanges would be bought and sold. So that would be also used goods are included in all exchanges of goods and services. It would also be stocks and bonds. Those are exchanges of goods and services. Those are not counted though. Used goods, what we're looking for is something that's talking about is the sum of all total spending, final goods and services, produced domestically during a period. I hope that makes sense. Easy enough. They do test GDP quite a bit. Make sure you have a good definition in your head. Let's calculate it. 32 here. I'm going to stop for a second, let you read this. Stop the screen, do whatever you push, pause, whatever. Read it, and then we're just going to jump in and answer it. All right. Again, what helps me here is that I know my formula is C plus I plus G plus XN. I know consumption is included. Government purchases, they could call it expenditures, doesn't matter. We know it's spending. Gross private domestic investment. They could have just wrote investment, would have been easier, but they put gross private to kind of throw you off. Don't be thrown off. Depreciation has nothing to do with our GDP formula. Exports, yes, and imports. And remember, it's exports minus imports. So this would have given us a negative 200. If you don't subtract those, you've got some problems. Business taxes are what we call a leakage to the GDP or circular flow. They would have actually, anyway, the taxes, depreciation never counted. So we would have added all those up. We would have got 4,500, I think is the right answer there. All right, let's jump over to what's excluded and included. And we've done this, we talked about these. Let's see if we can read that. Go ahead and pause, take a look at number 3, choose your answer, and then we'll walk our way through it. All right, let's see if we can figure it out. A says consumer purchase of a new car for personal use. That looks like consumption to me. Government purchase of a new car for the military. That's government spending. Businesses purchase a new car for a delivery vehicle. That's capital goods they're buying there, or we would call it investment. I want to sort of clear up things. I keep running into problems with the word capital. You should know that for this whole macro course, capital is never thought of as money until you get to the last foreign exchange unit. We're always going to think of capital of tools, equipment, manufacturing stuff, factories, right? Those are all capital goods. I guess the tricky thing is not really the good, but how it's used. If I buy a spoon for my house, my question to you would be, is it a consumer good or is it a capital good? Now, if it's a spoon for my house, I mean, obviously it's a consumer good. But if I bought that same spoon for my restaurant that I provide meals into people, that would make it a capital good. So understand it's not really the good. It was the same spoon, but it's how we use those spoons. Like I live in Arizona, so if I buy a tractor and put it out in front of my yard, like some kitschy people do, that tractor is not a capital good. It's a consumer good. It's just for decoration. If I buy the same tractor and I actually use it to produce vegetables and stuff, not out in the desert where I live, but anyway, if I used it, it would be a capital good. So it's not really the good, it's more about how it's used. Sometimes that's helpful. Consumers purchase a rare Renaissance painting. I don't know. Consumers purchase a haircut. This is just consumption again. So my question to you would be, why is D right? It's a bit tricky, right? But it is a used good. Now, were we taking GDP measurements back to the Renaissance? No, obviously, but it is a used good. So that's what gets it kicked out. Which of the following is our true correct? I'm going to stop for a second. I'm going to let you read that. Go ahead and pause. All right. Your spouse, sorry, I had a stroke there. Your spouse cleans your house every Thursday. That's what we call household production, right? Not included. You sell your old economic textbook. That's a used good, not included. Your economic textbook is revised and you buy a new edition. Well, this is new spending, new consumption, right? So that would be consumption and would count toward GDP. I hope that makes sense. Let's flow down a little bit. This is a bit of a weird question, too. Which of the following means of reducing military spending would have a positive impact on GDP? Take a moment, read those, stop it, pause, choose your answer. All right. A, if we combine two military bases and moved them overseas, well, think of all that government spending going overseas and it's not in our country. If it's not in our country, it can't be increasing our, think of all the consumption that would have gone on in a foreign country and for that overseas base would not have improved our GDP. Cutting retirement benefits to the middle where you spend, the government would be spending less, so that would be a reduction in GDP. Closing overseas military bases and moving them to the U.S., think about that. All those people come back to the U.S., they're all spending their money, consumption goes up, investment goes up, government spending goes up, right? Yada, yada. Closing military bases and laying off, you're not paying them if you're laying them off, so government spending would go down. Canceling contracts with domestic producers, all those good porky military contracts would be canceled. That would reduce government spending and reduce GDP. All right, number 2, pause, take a look, choose your answer. All right, which of the following transactions would represent an addition to a nation's current GDP? Mr. Smith purchases a share of stock. We said stocks and bonds are never included in GDP. A retailer increases her stock of imported shoes. Was it produced in our country? No, it was not. If it's not produced in our country, then imported goods are never included. They actually would have reduced GDP. The government increases its domestic purchases of food for use by the military. That's more government spending. That's going to make GDP kick up. Easy enough. D, a corporation sells shoes from last year's inventory. Now, there's that sort of investment inventory thing. Again, 2006, shoes are produced but not sold until 2007. You got to know which year GDP gets counted. A corporation sells shoes from last year's inventory. They were counted last year in 2006. The year they're sold, they're never counted. Tricky. A mother sells her cars, used goods. So not counted. Nicely done. 47. Which of the following best explains why transfer payments are not included in the calculation of GDP? Again, transfer payments, you just need to have it in your head. Welfare benefits, unemployment, Social Security. No production. There's nothing produced when that happens. So stop it. Read. Choose your answer. And done. We're not walking through these. These are time. This is a time waster. You have to read all of this. Just know recipients of transfer payments have not produced or supplied goods and services in exchange for these payments. Nothing's produced with transfer payments not included. Which of the following is included in the computation of GDP? Okay, go ahead, stop it, choose your answer. All right. Government transfer payments, never included. Purchase of used goods are not included. Child care tasks performed by house husbands, that's me. My stuff is not included. Total value of business inventories or additions to business inventories. Now that's fairly tricky, but again, it is what's produced in what year. It's all additions, it's increases, or it's changes to inventories, are all the words we're looking for to understand what goes in GDP. In 2006, we might have had some goods sold that were actually produced in 2005. So it can't be total values of business inventories because some of those goods were produced in 2005. That's a very tricky question. We're looking for additions, increases, and changes for inventories. Therefore, that flows into investment. Anyway, that's a very tricky question. I don't like it. 29. Which of the following will lead to an increase in GDP? Same question, different year. All right, go ahead, stop it. Find your right answer. More individuals prepare their own personal income tax forms. So isn't this household production? Does the government know that I performed my own tax forms? Well, they probably do, but they're not counting it toward GDP. Some citizens begin working abroad, not produced in our country, can't be counted. The government prohibits the sale. There's just no sales, so that wouldn't increase GDP. Foreign companies build new assembly plants in the U.S. Is that investment? I mean, it doesn't matter who's doing it, but if they're producing it in our country, got to be GDP. Used goods, not counted. Easy enough. 39. We're getting a sense of these. I think we're almost done here. 2010, a measurement of GDP. Investment includes spending by what? In essence, we're looking at a definition of investment. Go ahead and stop. Choose your answer. All right, we're just going to jump to this. Businesses on capital goods and changes. Remember, changes, increases, additions to inventories, and all capital goods is definitely investment. Number 7, the value of which of the following is counted in U.S. GDP? Stop it. Find your right answer. No clean air. Household production right there. That's not counted. Automobile produced in Sweden. Well, if it's produced in Sweden, can't be counted. Car produced in the United States and sold in Europe. Doesn't matter where it's sold, where it's produced. That's got to be our answer. Medical services not produced in our country, sold in another country. Easy enough. All right. Let's look at a couple of these investment inventories. There's enough of these on, I probably have 12, 13 of these different questions that you just have to know. One of these is pretty straightforward. Unexpected increases in inventories usually precede, well, think about that. This isn't straightforward. The question would be, why would we have more increases in inventories? Well, think about this. You own a shop. Every week, deliveries show up. You probably have a standing order with the producer, and you say, hey, send me a certain amount of hamburger buns every week. At some point, we start running into what we could call a recession, right? When there's a recession, the economy starts slowing down, but your producers are still going to keep sending you that same amount of hamburger, hot dog buns, whatever. You're going to have an increase in inventories, right? So, sorry, I'm having a brain fart here. Increases in inventories usually start before decreases in production. I hate this question. But the understanding is you have to figure out that during a recession, as more and more goods keep flowing to our shop, our inventories are going to increase. At some point, we're going to say, hey, stop sending us stuff. Nobody's buying it. And therefore, that would tell our producers that they need to decrease their production. So increases in inventories usually come before, precede decreases in production. That's a terrible question. Somebody ought to be slapped upside the head for that one. I don't like it. Which of the following would best explain a decline in potential GDP? Um, this one I don't. Yeah. If investment goes down, obviously we're going to have less potential, which is long run GDP. Don't worry about this. This is a very weird question, and I don't know that you'd ever see it on a test again. But negative net investment, obviously, if our investment, that would pull down our potential GDP. That, for those of you who have gone further than GDP, this is really like what we're talking about if our long run aggregate supply curve was to shift to the left. This would be negative net investment means less capital goods. We could also think about it as maybe a shifting in of our PPC. Again, this really isn't the section to talk about that, but that's that question. That was weird too. All right, 32, GDP. Why is it criticized? There's really three things that we need to know. One is environmental issues. The GDP doesn't take into account any whether we've grown more forests or less forests over the last 1,000 years. I think we figure out that we have more forests than ever before due to that we stop forest fires. But then all of a sudden, if we have a bad year and millions of acres are burned, we don't take that into account at GDP. Rivers flood and destroy different things. We don't take it into account at GDP. Household production. Again, we talked a little bit about that. Not enough. Some people think that household production should be included. Okay. And then distribution of income. I don't know how you'd add that in there, but I'm sure some economists could come up with a way. Distribution of income is not counted. Therefore, some people can criticize GDP about that. Those tend to be our three things we're looking for. Household production here for 32. A measure of economic welfare, GDP underestimates. Think about that, underestimates. Whereas GDP is counting things, but if it doesn't count household production, we know stuff's actually been produced there. So the official measurement doesn't include that, so it would be lower than if you did add it. If you added it, the actual amount of production in the country would be higher. That's why we say it underestimates it. Again, you have to sort of get used to their language. Tricky. Gross domestic product has been criticized as a measure of well-being because it fails to take into account distribution of income. All right, guys. Almost getting there. Nominal inflation, we just got to know this formula. And I'm going to give you all three of these formulas that you need to know. The first one is pretty simple. Nominal minus inflation. Know that the inflation and the price level are the same thing. Equals real. We could put GDP here if you want, right? Then we're just going to plug in some numbers. They're telling us inflation is 5%. Nominal GDP is 4. Therefore, real has to be a -1. Can you see that? Pretty straightforward knowing that formula. Now, there's other formulas you're going to have to know other than that one, which are helpful. Again, nominal minus inflation equals real, and that is expected inflation. We'll talk about that more when we do an inflation choice question. You could also say, by flipping this around, you could just say real plus inflation equals nominal. That's a truism. What I want you to also recognize is nominal minus inflation equals real. If there is no inflation, nominal has to equal real. This is going to help you when we're doing some GDP stuff, CPI kind of stuff, mostly CPI. All right, number 2, in a specified, year, nominal GDP grew by 11%. Nominal GDP grew by 11. Real grew by 4. Obviously, then inflation had to be 7. Does that make sense how we figured that out? I hope so. Take number 17, stop it for a second. Go ahead and read it. All right, if real GDP is increasing by 3% and nominal GDP is increasing by 7%, well, 7 minus what equals 3? It's got to be 4%. But recognize that inflation is going up by 4%, that's the same thing as saying the price level is going up by 4%. Easy enough. Number two, the major difference between real and nominal, got to have this definition in your head, is that real is adjusted for price level changes, right? We know it's nominal. We're extracting out those price level changes, or we could call it inflation. That's what's giving us our real numbers. All right, 47. This is a bit of a weird question. But this goes back, go ahead and read 47. I'll stop for just a second. All right. Ooh, I'm doing this all wrong. Give me a second. All right. We should know, again, we can flip this around and say real plus inflation equals nominal. This kind of helps us with this question. If the nominal GDP of the nation increases relative to the previous year, it must be true that, well, anytime nominal numbers go up, we just assume price level had to go up. We know that. So, but remember, nominal GDP, and let's think about that for just a second, because this is a fairly complicated question. Nominal GDP is just price times quantity. If I produce one apple and I sell that apple for $1, my nominal GDP is $1, right? Price times quantity. But looking at this, we really don't know which of these. Inflation, we're just going to assume anytime nominal numbers go up, you better assume inflation went up. They have to. You should also understand that it could have been real going up also. If real and inflation both go up at the same time, nominal has to go up. So price level and or real GDP has increased. You could get a nominal increase that real didn't change at all, then it had to be inflation going up, right? Since if nominal goes up and real, the quantity doesn't change, price level had to go up. Anyway, this becomes more sort of specified when we start doing some of the other problems with CPI questions. And I think this is all. I'm just going to throw this business cycle stuff and get it out of the way here. Business cycle, you should be able to draw this graph. You should recognize it as the business cycle goes up. It's an expansionary, that inflation as price levels are going up. You hit a peak, price levels are high, and they start having a contractionary economy. The trough is the bottom. Think of a pig trough, what pigs stick their heads in to eat. It's at the bottom of this, and this tends to be a recessionary effect down here. So this is more of an inflationary effect. But there's ways that the College Board asks these questions that are confusing. First of all, that that line there, that linear line, is what we call potential real GDP, also known as full employment. It is our natural rate of unemployment. It is long-run equilibrium. Some of that's not going to make sense to you, but that's fine. This is if we're at full employment. If I'm producing here, if that's full employment, but my economy is actually down here at the trough, definitely in some kind of a recession. Or I could say that actual unemployment, here we go, is greater than our natural rate of unemployment. If your actual unemployment is greater than your natural rate, we have to know that as a recession. The College Board loves to play games with these kinds of things. If you're producing in that recessionary sort of reduced output, you could say your actual, let's call it output, or real GDP, we can use those interchangeably. Actual output or real GDP is less than potential. If on the line is potential and my country is producing below that potential line, the actual output is less than potential. Again, that's how they throw it at us sometimes. It confuses people. That is a recession again. We could flip this around and know that if we're producing way up here at the expansion or somewhere in the peak, that our actual output is greater than potential. If the line is potential and we're producing way up here, we got to have more output than potential. We also know that when we're in an inflationary scenario, unemployment is very low, so your actual unemployment would be less than your natural rate. This is inflation. or an inflationary scenario or economy, whatever you want. You have to know this language. So just write it down. Make sure you understand it. Say it 20 or 30 times. Write it out because they're going to test you on it, I can promise you. Let's take a look at number 50. This is from 1990. Is the only released business cycle. They don't test it often, but we should probably expect at least one question in an exam. But I don't have many examples. Which of the following most likely occurred during the expansionary phase? Well, we know it's A. We know that there's going to be more output. Output is going to increase, and we know unemployment is going to go down. As output increases, people are making more stuff. That means people have to be hired to make that stuff, which means unemployment falls. Anyway, the only one for business cycle, make sure you know that graph, can draw it and explain everything on it. All right, guys, call it quits. That was a long video. Keep working hard. You're doing great. Be safe.